There is a catastrophe so large that it remade an entire people, not metaphorically. In the strict demographic, genetic, and cultural sense, the Great Famine that struck Ireland between 1845 and 1852 did not simply kill people and scatter others. It fundamentally altered what kind of people the Irish would be, what languages they would speak, what genes their descendants would carry, and where on earth those descendants would live. The numbers are the beginning but not the end of the story. A population of approximately 8 million people in 1845 lost 1 million to death and another million to emigration in 7 years. By the end of the 19th century, the population of Ireland had fallen to around 4 million, half of what it had been at the famine's start, and it would not recover to anything approaching that number for the better part of the following century. No comparable population collapse from a single event occurred in any part of Western Europe in the modern era. This was not a natural disaster in any simple sense. The potato blight, Phytophthora infestans, was biological. But 1 million people do not die of a plant disease in a country that simultaneously exports food, under an administration that possesses the administrative capacity to intervene and largely chooses not to. Without the operation of political and economic decisions that were made by identifiable people with identifiable interests. The famine was a disaster shaped by colonial policy in ways that historians have documented extensively and debated ferociously for generations. What the genetics now offer is a different kind of record. Not of the political decisions, but of the biological aftermath. Of who survived, and what the act of surviving under those specific conditions left in the genetic profiles of the people who came after. A series of studies published in the 2010s and early 2020s began analyzing ancient and historical DNA from Irish skeletal remains, including material from famine-era mass graves excavated at sites associated with the workhouse system that the British colonial administration operated as its primary institutional response to mass starvation. The workhouses were, by design, places of last resort. Entry required the surrender of any land holding. The conditions inside were deliberately harsh, based on a political philosophy that held that making relief too comfortable would encourage dependency. People who entered the workhouses were, by definition, those who had exhausted every other option. They were the most desperate, the most dispossessed, and disproportionately the poorest of the Irish poor. The DNA extracted from workhouse grave sites shows something specific and sobering about who died where. The individuals in these sites were genetically representative of the broader pre-famine Irish population in some respects, but skewed in others. They showed a higher concentration of ancestry profiles associated with the most rural, most economically marginal, most Irish language-speaking communities of the western seaboard. The people who died in the workhouses were not a random cross-section of Irish society. They were disproportionately drawn from the communities that were most dependent on the potato, most isolated from alternative food sources, and most lacking in the social and economic connections that allowed wealthier Irish people to access food during the shortage. This is not a surprising finding in its broad outline. Historians had long argued that the famine killed the poor and spared the better off. What the genetics provide is a biological confirmation of that distribution, and something more. They provide a tool for tracing, in the DNA of living populations, which communities were most severely reduced by the famine, and how that reduction changed the genetic composition of both the Irish in Ireland and the Irish diaspora that the emigration created. The emigration itself left a genetic signature that researchers are only beginning to fully characterize. The 1 million people who left Ireland during the famine years, and the millions more who followed in the decades immediately after, carried with them a genetic profile that was shaped by the same selective pressure that shaped who died. They were not a random sample of the pre-famine Irish population. They were disproportionately drawn from specific regions, specific social classes, and specific linguistic communities. The famine-era emigrants from Connacht, the western province most devastated by the blight, carried with them haplogroups and ancestry profiles concentrated in communities that were among the oldest continuous populations in the British Isles. With deep roots in the pre-Neolithic Atlantic populations that had inhabited the western margins of Europe since before the Bronze Age. This is the Basque connection in miniature, the same Atlantic fringe population that preserved pre-Indo-European genetic signatures in isolated coastal communities, now scattered across the cities of the eastern United States, Canada, and Australia by the most traumatic forced dispersal in Irish history. When geneticists compare the DNA of Irish Americans, whose ancestors emigrated during the famine years, to the DNA of Irish people whose families remained in Ireland through the 19th century and beyond, they find measurable differences that reflect the famine's selective pressure. The immigrant line shows elevated frequencies of certain ancestry components associated with the Western Irish population at the time of departure. The stay-behind line shows a different distribution, shaped by who died, who left, and who was able to remain. Two populations descended from the same pre-famine Ireland, carrying different genetic emphases because the catastrophe sorted them differently. The ships that carried the emigrants were themselves a form of selection. The better-off emigrants, those with enough money to pay for cabin passage on regular vessels, arrived in better health and in better condition to establish themselves in the new country. The poorest emigrants traveled in the cargo holds of timber ships returning empty from North America, vessels that were not built for human transport, and that made the crossing in conditions so brutal that the ships became known as coffin ships. The mortality rates on these vessels, from disease, from overcrowding, from the malnutrition with which passengers boarded, were sometimes catastrophic. A passenger who boarded a coffin ship at Cobh or Liverpool was not guaranteed to arrive. And the people who boarded those ships were the people who had nothing left to lose by the voyage, because they had already lost everything else. The genetics of the communities that built Little Ireland in Boston, the Five Points in New York, the Irish neighborhoods of Philadelphia and Baltimore, are in part the genetics of the people desperate enough to take those ships. That specific desperation, that specific poverty, carried specific genetic profiles, and those profiles are, in attenuated and blended form, still present in the DNA of their descendants 5 and 6 generations later. There is a dimension of the famine's genetic legacy that the DNA studies have only recently begun to address, and it is one that goes beyond the questions of who survived and who emigrated. The famine was also, and catastrophically, the famine of the Irish language. In 1845, perhaps half of Ireland's 8 million people spoke Irish as their primary language. The communities in which Irish was dominant were precisely the communities most dependent on the potato, most rural, and most devastated by the famine. The famine killed Irish speakers at a rate dramatically higher than the rate at which it killed the English-speaking Irish. The emigration removed more Irish speakers than it removed English speakers, both in absolute terms and as a proportion of their respective communities. The linguistic map of Ireland that emerged from the famine was a drastically reduced version of the one that had existed before it. This is not strictly a genetic story, but it is a biological one. The communities that carried the language were also the communities that carried specific genetic profiles, specific ancestry patterns, specific cultural and ecological knowledge systems. The famine did not simply kill people and scatter them. It disproportionately dismantled the communities that were the repositories of a specific form of Irish cultural and biological heritage. And what that dismantling left behind, both in Ireland and in the diaspora, is a population that is measurably different in its genetic composition from the population that the famine found, not better or worse, different, reshaped by a catastrophe that was not random in its effects, but followed the precise contours of poverty, language, and political powerlessness. The DNA of living Irish and Irish American people is not simply a record of ancient migrations and prehistoric population movements. It is also a record of 1847, of who entered the workhouse and did not come out, of who boarded the coffin ships at Cub and Westport and arrived at Boston Harbor and built lives in cities that greeted them with signs reading, "No Irish need apply." Of who survived in the western townlands through the worst years and passed the Irish language to their children and watched it diminish across the following generations until it became a symbol of what had been lost rather than a living medium of daily life. Of who made the calculation, in the worst years, that staying was death and leaving was only the possibility of something different. Every one of those calculations is still present in the genetic profiles of the people who resulted from them. The famine shaped not just who lived and who died, but who married whom in the new country, which communities formed and which dispersed, which genetic lines continued, and which ended in an unmarked grave in a workhouse yard in County Mayo or at the bottom of the Atlantic. The genetics do not tell us what the famine felt like from the inside. They do not tell us the names of the people in the workhouse graves, whose identities in many cases were never recorded, because the system that put them there had no interest in their individual humanity. They do not recover the specific experience of watching a field of blackened potatoes and understanding what the next year would bring. What they tell us is the aggregate biological consequence of all those individual moments of decision and loss. And what that aggregate shows is something that every Irish-American family that traces its origins to the famine years carries in its cells without knowing it. A specific pattern of ancestry that reflects where their ancestors came from, what social position those ancestors occupied, and what catastrophe shaped the decision that eventually brought their family to wherever in the world they now live. The famine is not over in the genetics. It is present in every haplogroup that traces to the western seaboard communities most devastated by the blight. It is present in every ancestry estimate that clusters in the Irish townlands that lost half their population in 7 years. It is present in every Irish-American family whose story begins with a ship and a harbor and a city that did not want them but got them anyway, and was changed by them in ways that are still visible in the demographic and cultural map of the eastern United States today. The past is not past, it is in the blood. And the DNA is only now giving us the precision to read what the blood has always carried, in the cells of the descendants of the people the famine made, and unmade, and scattered to the far edges of the world it had always known.